they're going to be related. More questions than married. Like yesterday, I think the topic is I feel like I want to do something bad to myself. What should I think? Like that's a harder section to ask questions in. Two quick reflections from yesterday before we begin this morning. From a lot of questions that you asked me and a lot of conversations I had, which were really helpful. And I should have said this more. Marshall Brown calls it all the most inconvenient moments. The one thing I did mean to say that I left out at the end is, I think the most important strategic decision a human being ever makes, men and women, even while they're having children, is to get a hobby. So the reason I think you especially need a hobby that is not work and is not related to your work is that you need something in your life that is measurable and achievable. And ministry is not measurable and achievable, right? On some level it is. I would never really say there's no matrix, but we all know that when you're doing ministry with people, even in the victories you're having, then later you find out after they went to high school or in life they turned away, and then all the people you thought, oh man, nothing is happening, they become elders. It's really ironic. And that can be its own disturbing thing. So like, mine's golf. Figured out ways to play. When we had 3 young children, I only played 9 holes. I chipped a lot in my backyard. But what I needed 44 strokes. I needed to go out and experience that. And my wife's hobby became buying children's clothes, especially, I realize this is 15 years ago, smock children's clothes, in consignment stores and in thrift stores, and selling on eBay. So like, she had a running chart of her the biggest one. So 50 cents and $48 was her best. Wow. She bought this smock dress because it was like half off at Goodwill, and then she had half off a coupon they put in the mail. She got it for 50 cents, sold it for 48. So that was really her hobby. And Marissa and I have really done a good job in our lives of having a life together, and worked at that, and what do we like to do together, but also having something where you go out and you do something. I think it's important for moms especially in having young children, because when you have children, it feels like they might die if you leave them alone. And so, like in our life, and this is sweet in RUF, one morning I would stay home for 3 hours, and then I would hire a babysitter for 2 because of work, and she would. One morning I took off, and that was kind of when I played golf. And we were really zealous to protect each other's time to go do these things. So just, one of the things I think you need, being outside of your world helps you be sane. And this wasn't what I was talking about yesterday. I think some of you still not married, and that's a very good thing according to the Apostle Paul. But if you're married and having children, those young children of yours are just hard. They're truly glorious, but they just really, really are hard. And that's I meant to say that yesterday at the end, that I just think you got to have a hobby. So, and that hobby doesn't have to be golf. By the way, don't do golf. I'm trying to think. Do racquetball. Just go there, close, hit something hard, and maybe you lose all the time. But there's something to achieve. It is cheaper than golf. I made all the wrong mistakes. I'm a golfer and a skier. Our family loves to ski because these people invite us to ski conferences to speak. They let us go free. My children actually liked it. Then I discovered what it cost to go skiing, and now we're in debt. Really not easy to go skiing. So, having said that, this morning's topic is called Understanding Yourself and Your Church. And so we're going to do it in 2 sections. Understanding yourself, understanding your church. We have about an hour and 45 minutes. And so let me pray for us and we'll get started. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for rest and for food and for fellowship. Thank you for this time together and for RYM and for your kindness and your goodness and your grace and mercy to RYM and to us. And thank you for all the people who've heard about who you are and what you've done, about your gentleness and graciousness, and for all the conferences and this training. We pray that we would mutually encourage one another, that you would help us to grow in grace, and that my words might be encouraging and beneficial to these folks, that it might cause them to grow in grace and grow in knowledge and grow in insight into you and into them. Pour out the Holy Spirit on us, Jesus, and we pray this in your name. Amen. If you were to ask me what the primary purpose of training is, oh, there you are, for RUF, and we in RUF, we force our campus ministers, I don't think it's forced, but that's a good word. You're required to come to training twice a year, 1 week in July, 1 week in December. If you ask me what the primary purpose of that training is, it is to help you become comfortable with you. And this relates a little bit to your question at the end of last evening, is that the most important thing I can do for you as a person in ministry, the most important thing that I can do for a campus minister is to help them figure out who they are and how they work and what they want to do. This isn't like a profound thing we're going to do today, but I think it's an important thing. I left my thing. I got a big old thumbprint right there and left my thing. That's okay. Your ability to figure you out is going to be related to two things: your ability to enjoy ministry on some level and your ability to last. Thank you. You're going to heaven. There is salvation by works. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean. When we do this thing called assessment. Thank you. And in that assessment, which somebody here is coming to in a couple weeks. John Trapp's coming here. That's right. People come all concerned about assessment, like, oh my gosh, it's going to be terrible. Our question in assessment is, who are you and your wife, and what are your plans, and what kind of campuses do we have open? And that's kind of the second part, understanding your church. Like, all I want to do is I want to understand you, because, not because I'm obsessed with you and stalked you on Facebook, but because helping you understand you is, again, it's the most important thing I can do. So, and so I'm going to do this a little bit through my story and have you ask me questions. And so I want you to see in my story the two difficulties you're going to have in knowing yourself. Your first difficulty is your experience. Your second difficulty is your expectation, so you actually can have some ease. Your experience and your expectation. God called me into ministry, which means I decided I wanted to go to seminary. That's the extent of my call. There's no light, no moment. Because I was teaching a Bible study my senior year at Clemson on Richard Pratt's Pray With Your Eyes Open to 12 men, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. That book for that semester lent itself to a lot of growth and fellowship. In that particular semester at Clemson, and that was way back in 1988. My campus minister, David Sinclair, who had about 200 people come into his large group experience, had 45 small group Bible studies in place. Now, I don't know how much you know about an RUF on campus. Some of you have been involved in it. Some of you only know about it vaguely. But anyone who can get 45 small group Bible studies going on the college campus is Jesus Christ. I mean, that semester, Jesus left heaven and the throne, and it's like I remember we met in the at Clemson. There's a YMCA on campus that the university owns, and we met in a room that's about 3 times the size of this. And there was a sign-up sheet like every foot all the way around the room, and 6 to 8 people signed up for it. And that was the most profound growth of my life. I grew. I learned a lot. Not only did I learn about prayer, I made friends in that Bible study. David Moore, who's I think now an elder at Mitchell Road. David Kuhn, who's an elder at St. Andrews. Bob, who is an elder at Cornerstone in Columbia. Marty Martin, who's a pastor in Spartanburg. That Bible study was sweet, and it had a profound impact. It ultimately propelled me on to seminary. When I did go to David Sinclair, I wanted to go to seminary. It was a long pause. We still didn't, what you do about that? How was that one-on-one you're having with somebody? And they're like, I'm going to do this. And you're like, huh, never thought you should do that. So David was really sure he tried to talk me out of it. David Sinclair can't talk anybody out of anything, so he just sort of suggested I do some things, which I thought I did, and I didn't do, and I went anyway. But that's okay. And so I went to seminary, and while I was in seminary, I actually got involved in the church in St. Louis, outside of St. Louis, minister, was involved in a small group. But when I left seminary, I went to Belhaven and started the 3 most frustrating years of my ministry, by far. And I don't mean dark, I just mean frustrating. Because when I got to Belhaven, I was bound and determined to start a small group ministry. I was going to move heaven and hell to have, I think in my first small group, my first large group at Belhaven, there were 35 people. Managed to get that down to 1, Josh, who was the guitar player who had to come that first year, and then later. But even after I sort of changed, and was able to sort of rebuild the ministry from my own destruction, I did it through freshmen. I spent 3 years trying to force people to do small groups. Now this is profound for me, because what I was doing was I was letting my experience determine what I did in my ministry. Right? My experience had been that David Sinclair created an atmosphere and a ministry that ran on small groups. And students, I was mad at students. I mean, I don't think the students see, but internally I was mad, very mad at students, because when this is interesting looking back on it. My large group, I had a lot of juniors and seniors when I started, and as I rebuilt it, that large group was growing again, like 20, 25, 30. It wasn't like this massive thing. But it was slowly growing. That didn't touch me. All I could see was I would do 5 small groups, and they would all fail. Couldn't get you can't get a women's small group going. I mean, who are you? Like, you can always get a few women get together and study the Bible passionately and love each other, and then sort of judge each other the way they dress. But you can always get that. Like, I get that guys weren't doing this, but I couldn't get anything. I even had good women come on campus to teach it, and it failed. And I really began to spiral. And in my 3rd year, I went to my supervisor, who was Bebo Elkin, who still lives in Jackson, for years and years for RYM, and just said, hey, I think I need to quit ministry. And I remember where I was sitting in his office. This was an old office he had over by the medical center on the 3rd floor, and it was a really small little office. And he said, John, but it's going great at Belhaven. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, nobody's growing. There's no ministry going on. And he said, well, I mean, I know like you had 30 people in your large group. I know like you took 15 to a conference. I'm like, yeah, but nobody's growing. So we spoke for about an hour, and Bebo was just really good. He listened to me. He let me blow up. And finally, he just said this. He goes, Stone, you got to figure you out. Nobody's like David Sinclair. And I want you to forget about David Sinclair. And that was actually one of the most liberating moments in my life, because do any of you happen to know David Sinclair? So the few of you who know David Sinclair and me will think, like, we're the most opposite people ever created. I mean, David Sinclair wakes up at 4 every morning, studies his Bible 3 hours, still exegetes the Greek for every sermon, can still read the Greek and primarily read the Hebrew. He's, by anybody's definition, a geek. He's had the same mustache for 41, 42 years. Exactly the same. His schedule is just, hyper the same. David Sinclair has never said to you, so we've had people work on staff with him, I'm sure he said it, but like, to the normal congregant, like, you just wonder, I know his heart beat twice this week. Does he feel anything? He just is he's just very in control. And it's even hard for me now to look back and, like, David's ministry, both in terms of RUF at Clemson and then at Lexington Perez and now at Clemson Perez. It's undisputed. So what I'm about to say is more about my perception. I can only realize in hindsight that David and I had nothing in common at all. Like, nothing. There's nothing wrong about that, except that for me, David Sinclair was what ministry had to be. It was the way I had experienced ministry, the way I had grown in ministry. And here are some of the things I discovered about myself, and then I want to propel you to think deeply about yourself on them. So as I began, like one of the, Bebo said, Stone, figure yourself out. And it feels like to me, he said, it feels like to me you just need to make that large group work and quit worrying about the small groups. So the next semester, I remember not advertising any small groups and one started. That's kind of ironic, right? That's the semester one started. And I really concentrated on large groups. I mean, and it really, Bellhaven's RYF really changed. I mean, I was always doing ministry because God was at work, right? But my ability to really, like, okay, I've got to speak to students through large group. And I really found my voice, and I really began to enjoy large group. It's odd that I would say this about myself, but I didn't see large group as that important because I was really stuck at Clemson. Now that can feel like the second part of what we're going to do this morning, but it's not. But my experience was really destroying my ability to find me. I think this is, some of you are old enough that you've worked through this, but as you do ministry, you've got to own that your experience isn't necessarily the way you're going to do things. Like you could have grown in a context that you might not be able to create. So one of the things I discovered at the University of Tennessee about myself was that I cannot lead a small group. I cannot do it. Like that's what I can't do it. I can teach you how to do it. I can teach you what you need to do. I can coach you into it. Cannot do it. There's two things that happened with every small group I had at the University of Tennessee. Without exaggeration. When a small group started, they generally started, 6 to 15 people, right? They all started in that range around various subjects about Scripture or books or anything related to Christianity. My Bible studies did one of two things. I can identify 14 of them at the University of Tennessee that by the middle of the semester had no one attending. I don't mean one like the guilty kid that was Baptist who was like coming. I mean, they died. They died the death of shame and grief and pain. I'm in the room at the UC. I know no one's coming. I've got to sit there till 10 minutes after, and then I've got to take it off the announcement sheet. The Bible study on Romans is dead. Or the second kind of Bible studies I had, and it really wasn't related to sections. I think it was just me giving me permission to be me. They just became many large groups. And they went from 6 to 15 to 20 to 30. I've never seen a small group that I didn't want to turn into a large group. I'm much more comfortable talking. I've certainly grown in this, but I can't redirect the heresy of a small group. Like, I've seen people who are genius at that. Like, you're in a small group, and this person says, straight up heresy. I just see the way God's changing his mind, and how he just he just wishes I could change, and he just won't force my will to anything. And I've seen, I can name several men and women I've watched in these contexts, and they're like, that's such a good answer. And they just take that answer and they roll in the groups with them. I get in that moment and go, thanks. And the thanks is an indication to everybody that I think the person is wrong and should be changed. And so my Bible studies at work, like I did one on the parables one semester. It started off with 9 people and it ended with 40. And I stood in the front of the room and I talked for 40 minutes, and then they did question and answer. But that's in no sense a small group. Like, just don't lie to yourself. That's not a small group. There's nothing small group. I did a freshman one through the years. In the first 4 years at UT, of my 7, the really first 3.5 it failed. Halfway through that middle year, I was like, forget this. And I stood up, started getting 60, 70 freshmen to come. That's just who I am. Now, some people would say, and this is important, John, if you say that, it can sound arrogant. No, I'm just saying that on my feet, this way, for whatever reason, the way I was made, I get. There are a bunch of people that when they sit down and put them in a circle, they're on. These are gifts. And when you have to figure out what your gift is, and unfortunately it's often not what you want it to be. It's still a gift though. And when you won't believe this about me, but I'm tired of hearing myself talk. I want to be, like, even though I realized he had a painful end, Steve Malone, I did a lot of small groups in Steve Malone's presence. He was a genius. He was a genius of small groups. He got everybody talking and everybody sharing and everybody involved. And no matter how hard I tried to do that, I failed. I'm miserable at it. And so because my experience at Clemson was so powerful, I did not allow myself to become who I needed to be. And so you see that not only was my experience getting me, but I had this expectation I want to piggyback on, that what my RUF would look like David Sinclair's RUF. Well, yeah.
John, how would you say in your life, how long did it take you to realize you were being driven by experience, to realize what your gifts were? I ask that because I feel like in some ways, you're at 50 and you figured that out. I don't know that I've figured that out about myself yet. So how do you get there in the middle, in the in-between years of figuring out, okay, this is what I'm about, and this is what I need to be comfortable in those in-between years. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it took me till about probably early 40s, mid-40s to admit it. This job was a curveball in that, like, when you go from actual kind of identifiable ministry to this other kind of ministry, I didn't have the same, I never had to do a small group. I did blow up 2 community groups at Redeemer Church, which is where I really learned this. I didn't blow them up. We just started and they failed. And then when I finally said to one, I'm not teaching, we're going to drink beer and you have to buy food. If you don't bring wine or food, you can't come back. The thing blew up and worked. It took off. But the other 2 were like, but that was actually, I kind of had been blaming college students on my lack of ability with a small group. So when I really did it with adults at Redeemer, that was the period on John Stone will not lead a small group. He won't lead a discussion. I will find people who love that and empower them to do it. And I can describe, not by experience, how to do those. But I think, Robert, it took me for a long time. But I don't mean by this, I want to be careful that I don't have to work outside some of my area. You can't just always work in your gifted area. But I think that because y'all are generally, I'm wanting to give you permission to be who you are. Is what I'm. But your question is still fair.
I'm just saying, as a youth pastor, you're a generalist.
Right.
So you're doing small groups, you're doing large groups, you're doing administrative, you're doing everything.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which you don't have, you can test a lot of those things, but you don't get preaching opportunities as much as maybe you would in a normal situation. So I'm just saying, for me, as I'm hearing this, I have the experience of Grace Perez working with Joey that I feel like probably in an idealistic world I've always tried to repeat.
Right.
And so I'm just trying to think, where do you, especially as a youth pastor, in a generalist nature of it, it just takes time to identify, I think.
It does. But I want to give, Robert, you're asking. No, it's a good question. But I would think I have a lot of thoughts there.
Can I throw a thought at him? It's your class, but
no, throw away, man.
Well, what we in student ministry, most of us don't have the opportunity to say, well, I'm not going to lead a small group, I'm going to inspire others to do it. We have to do all those things. And I think what the principle he could be aiming at that all of us need to hear is that we need to adjust our expectations of ourselves in those different venues. It's okay if you're not the best small group leader in your ministry, even though you're the youth pastor. I can say categorically I'm not the best small group leader in any ministry I've ever been a part of. And I aspire to be as great as some of the people who are like, how do you even do that? So as you do the different pieces, be okay with the fact that, your wheelhouse is training volunteers. Your wheelhouse is reaching those kind of fringe kids. Your wheelhouse is large group. Manage those other things, but find your happy place, so to speak.
No, I think that's right. And the reason I would say that I would do this section first and then understanding your church second is whether we all agree on this or not. If you surveyed PCA, all the PCA churches and all their staff, you would find out, because some people have done this in CP, that about 70% of all people are really frustrated. They're not necessarily unhappy, not the dark, everybody's getting a divorce question. That's just life. That's your neighborhood. But there's just sort of frustration. And I'm not jumping too far. The real answer to that is the PCA's unwillingness to spend money frustrates people, because you now put people in places where they have to do 3 or 4 things they can't do. And they still have to do them. But I'm saying you probably can't begin to build a team of leadership, we'll talk about in a second, until you understand the first. Mm-hmm. Because I've heard you say this, but you can't look at your strengths. I think Chris Talley said this to me yesterday and go, now let me operate my weaknesses to make them my strengths. The truth is, mature people, and this isn't not being a servant, and this isn't what I can do is one-on-ones and preach and get things going in the right direction. That's my skill set. I cannot do details, and I cannot do small groups. So let me do these things, and now my team has got to come in here. If I keep building team members who can preach and do one-on-ones, our church is going to fail. But the irony is, often people like you are attracted to you, and sometimes the opposite. So you can't start to really think about, how do I get myself in a place where I can succeed, unless I at least acknowledge, this will be a big one for the men in the room. I went to seminary to be a preacher. In Reformed circles, preaching is this highest, like, if you can't preach, you're useless. And the Bible just doesn't say that at all. So, like, the minute you go, I'm not the everyday preacher, and some people are, but I'm not the everyday preacher. While that can be a season of real struggle and calling, you're about to find yourself. You really are, in a way that lets you go figure out where to serve and where you need to be. And I see this a lot in my job, because I get to go all over the country, and you find a lot of men, and not because of RYM and committees and PC, and I don't bump into as many women, but they would be there too, but who are in their second career loving it. Because they all planted a church in the PCA, just in the next sentence is funny. They all did it in downtown, small town, somewhere that doesn't have an urban setting. It basically worked, because all the Reformed people drove into their church, because there's the only Reformed thing within like 400 miles. They had no urban setting. They lost themselves. There were no non-Christians. They were doing lectures on Calvin. They got depressed. And then they realized, the only thing that really worked was when I did this men's ministry, right? And then they go find a place to do men's ministry, and they're loving it. And so I am saying, Robert, it takes a long time. I'm trying to give you permission here to admit that you're probably not what you experienced. And most of us can't see that. I'll come right back to you. This is especially true for REF students, because there is sort of a ruggedness in RUF. Like, a lot of people ask me, like, what's the secret sauce in RUF? There's no secret sauce in RUF. The secret sauce in RUF is, I'm going to put you, trained to be the most conservative human being on the face of the earth, in the most liberal place in your community. And you'll either figure out how to talk to them, or you'll go get another job. And so, if you last, you're the most conservatively trained person in the history of the world, in the most liberal place in your community, working in the most conservative church in your community, communicating to like, pansexuality. Like, and the people who can do that typically are verbal communicators. And so in RUF, you have a lot of people where you're like, I changed under the preaching of Brian Haydick. I changed under the preaching of John Stone. Fair enough. That doesn't make you a preacher. And I know why you wanted that, right? I know why you wanted to be in that. There's nothing, but that's not who you are. And when you figure out who you are, then you can fly. I mean, I wouldn't be able to articulate this as well for women, but there are all these sort of alpha women in the PC. It's the same thing. Like, I've got to be her. Please don't be her. Please be you. Please be whoever God made you to be. And we need all sorts of people. But what I'm pointing out is you've got to own that the way God brought you is not maybe the way God wants you to go. That's very hard for us to admit. And that creates expectations. Like David Sinclair did a one-on-one with me when he was trying to figure out why I wanted to go to seminary and trying to talk me out of it. And his one-on-one, this is crazy looking back on it, was to help me learn how to do a small group, which is why he had 45. That was his go-to was, John, go take this passage, read it, do questions. And that's how he did it. All my first, he taught me to do a small group. Now, David would then, you talk to him about stuff. But David never once said, and look, again, if I have Dave Sinclair's ministry, go on to heaven. Get to skip the grace thing, go straight to heaven if you have Dave Sinclair's ministry. But David never once turned and said, man, how are you? Like, where's your pain? So again, I started doing one-on-ones at Bellhaven, and students are like, what's wrong with you? You make me nervous.
Except for me.
But in general, what I learned was the one-on-ones at work were ones I didn't see coming. Like, somebody'd swing by my office, Holly would sit down and say, da-da-da-da, Jack. And I'd like, you hate Jack and want to murder him, but you're engaged to him. I'd say this, she'd be like, but for me, that wasn't a one-on-one. Now, y'all know Holly. So yes. Holly's engaged to this guy. She hated his guts. Yeah. Really did hate him and was going to marry him. Not just didn't like him. I'm talking about pretty passionate murder. Never did get that one. Or I would be walking on a sidewalk and someone would say, hey, John, hey, how are you? Da-da-da. Hey, I would just do this. Like, hey, I'm sorry you've been sad lately. If you ever need to talk about being sad, what I'm thinking is come in, I'll open the Bible, I'll teach you to do a small group, and that'll help you with your sad. Right? You have this expectation. And they'd be like, nobody knows I'm sad. How did you know I'm sad? I'm like, you didn't. I mean, look, you didn't smile for the last 3 weeks. Like, so but I couldn't see. So the way I do one-on-ones is, when you walk in, I'm like, all right, get your inner child out, feed them, get them crying, and then let's go talk about it. I want to talk about your inner child. So of course, I married a woman whose inner child is locked behind 12 doors of titanium, who's never seen the light of day. My inner child's running around naked, screaming, I'm hurt, I'm in pain, help me. It makes for a really fun marriage. It makes for a really, truly fun marriage. Like, my wife can now say, you need to put the child up and help me do the dishes. Okay. But for me to say, like, I had this, David Sinclair, not true today, and that RUF was so reformed. I mean, this is the 80s, give us a break. Like, if you, like, counseling was evil, right, way back. Like, if you're a counselor and you're reformed people abhorred counseling, which is why we're so destroyed here 30 years later. But by nature, I'm a counselor, not a discipler. By nature, I elicit. Like, if I go to a party, my wife senses who is socially ostracized and that we're running out of chips and really owns that room and really empowers the party. It's a beautiful thing. And I don't notice that the chips are running low, but I think, man, that person has been sexually abused and never talked about it. And I can't tell you why. I'm not, but like, I'll go talk to them. And so, like, Marissa and I get free. Like, for the longest time, for instance, I wanted her to be me, and she wanted me to be her, right? So now that we know that when we walk in the room for the party, or even if we're throwing it, we'll do really different things. We're really happy with each other. But I had to own that what I'm going to do is generally talk about your pain. That's what I want to talk about. I want to get to your heart that way. There are other avenues to people's hearts. I mean, just teaching the Bible and somebody hearing it, you being a good exegete, you teaching them to study it, you putting them in a social setting where they relax, you taking them on a retreat room, all those things are legitimate. It's just that I know that for me, I want to move towards one-on-twos, basically, or two-on-ones, about pain, and that how I'm really surprised about this about myself. Like, I operate pretty well in a section of pain. That took me 10 years to figure out. And it made me really frustrated with my ministry. What I'm trying to do, I'm not trying to do something profound. You can go online and take 55 personality tests, and they're helpful. No, they are. But you've got to give yourself permission to be who you are in ministry. And then to move into that place. And to move towards that place. I've told somebody, you go.
Yeah. I think the thought that's going through my head is I think one of the expectations we have, maybe it's Western culture, maybe it's PCA, but the way we tend to operate, especially starting out in ministry, is, okay, what are my weaknesses? I need to fix my weaknesses. I'm not good at small groups. I need to figure out how to do small groups. I hate logistics. I need to figure out how to do detailed planning work. And there's some truth to that. We need to have a certain level of competence to do the things that our job requires. But, one of the things we do is we get stuck there. We don't ask the question, what am I strong at doing? What am I good at doing? And being okay with, building a ministry around my strengths. So if you're a good teacher, having a youth ministry that has a lot of teaching. If you're a good small group leader, really emphasizing small groups. If you're good recruiting, people to do one-on-one ministry, recruiting people to do one-on-one ministry and letting that define what your ministry is in a particular church.
Yeah, I would say, y'all talk about this in other classes, and we can pick our number of things, but I'm picking this randomly. Do not later ask me what they are because I'm making this number up. But let's say there are 7 things everybody has to do, to sort of have an effective ministry. Or let's just even say there's 7 natural things that flow out of most ministry. The most anybody gets is 4. And that's only about 2% of the population. Most of us get 3 or 2. And so I think this matters because what I would have said at younger ages, I got to go learn to do these. And now what I say is, I've got to build a team to do that. Like this affects my view of my church and even my willingness to take a job because I recognize that I do believe this. Everybody can recruit, meaning anybody can say, will you come do this? Would you be willing to serve this way? And this is not what this class is designed to do. One of the hard truths is, I've seen people do this really well professionally, is certain ones of these really rub each other wrong. The uber mercy person can get sort of sideways with the uber teacher person. But in some ways, you've got to be able to recruit a team and recognize that teams are loose confederations. You've got to give some people more freedom than others. That your actual formalized structure is not your whole leadership structure. So like in the PCA, quite honestly, sessions are essentially failures. And what I mean by that is, you can quote me on this, you can tell everybody this. So it has to be true on some level that what Paul meant is that you recruit families to be leaders in churches, not just men. And especially sort of in a modern context. So it seems clear to me, at least, that you are ordaining families more than you are ordaining men. And so that introduces a much more robust way of thinking about women in ministry. And I don't mean just that single women can't do it or only married women can do it, but your leadership in a good PCA church means that you have very powerful, they can be servants, humble, quiet, introverted, extroverted, they can have disabilities, they can be uber, but you have very powerful people, women, affecting your church. And one of the voices in your church is that. And so when I say this and say, like once I figure out what I can do, if I'm going to take a church, I'm not going to scare off the people doing this. I'm not going to try to stop them. But I've got to start saying, how do these other things come? And how do I get them? How do I recruit them? How do I give them the freedom to serve? This is a big deal, and this is going to affect the way you think about your church. But I would never say, Robert, your point is right. So you get hired to be the youth minister at Sweetwater, at Christ Presence Sweetwater. You're doing all 5 of these things the first 5 months, and you're just realizing, let me show a movie at small groups so they'll stay, or if you're bad at small groups, or, I'll try to get some other people to do the front group teaching. But you almost immediately, if you're honest, have to say, I've got to figure out, even in this context, the 3 other people that can help me, because I can't do all this. And if I try to, this is where I'm going to get depressed, mad. I mean, workaholics are just people trying to do a bunch of stuff they can't do a lot of times. Right? They're just going to do it all, and it's destructive to them. Yes, sir.
When I had the blessing of being a part of RUF staff training when I was with MTW, y'all talked about it takes 3 years to know your campus. So in the midst of all of this, I think it's about the same for a church.
Yeah. No,
in my own experience, I mean, just being there 2.5 years, I think I'm just now beginning to get a feel of what Lawndale is.
That's my second point.
Yeah, okay. I'll let.
But it's fair. I'm saying.
I mean, if you're saying like 5 months, well, I'm doing all this because I can't get a small group together to save my life because no kid has time to do anything because they're all highly successful families and things like that. So the only time I get them is on Wednesday and Sunday.
Right.
So but even thinking about trying to bring all these people together, I mean, how am I going to even know who's who until I've been there a while?
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, I think the reason I'm persuading Joy to let me talk about this because many of you are in really good places with good ministry, but you're going to come to a good crossroads, not like some dramatic. Like, I know who I am. I've seen what I've done.
Yeah.
And I want you to try to make a more informed, wise decision about yourself and your future, and not just go, well, the next thing's the best thing, or the step up's the bigger thing. The step up can be a stop down for a lot of people. Like it can be hard. But I think that this goes back to my first point yesterday. I feel like I live in a world of people, and it's okay, I love them, who are just idealists. And so, again, I need to be good up front to be successful in the PCA. That's just not true. It's just, I actually don't know if Paul was a good preacher. You really don't. You don't. I mean, he goes into towns and says, if you keep your industry going, you're going to hell. Like, that's not successful preaching, and they stone him. And then he does a small group outside of town. So I'm not sure what Paul's like. And I'm trying to give you real freedom to acknowledge who you are and what you are so that you can step forward. Kurt.
I was just going to say, I think the saddest moment in my ministry is when I realized that was not Brian Hayden.
No.
I campus ministered, and but to your point though, like, yeah, you're sad. Amen to that. Y'all wonder where I get it. So, but like, I think when you get out of seminary and you're full of, whatever they
vinegar.
put you in
You're full of
seminary.
vinegar.
Yeah, you're just angry at the world or whatever, or you just think you got it all figured out. Like the worst thing to hear is like, hey, you're not very good at any of this. But that's what you learn. That's like that's the hard part. Like, anyway, I should say like how much, like the people that we celebrate in ministry are never the people who are good at small groups or details. Like the people that we celebrate in ministry.
I think, Kurt, fair enough. I think that's true in the places we tend to gather in the PCA. I don't think that's true in local context.
Yeah. Okay.
So fair enough. Like the trouble with sort of our big denominational machinery is that you're not going to in a GA context put the guy up. And there are a lot of these men who've really had these great churches, who've really kind of built them a community group and mission. But but his preaching's just sort of okay. I mean, God's called him to it. He's faithful in it, and he's wise. But he just doesn't carry the room. But if you get among his people, they all die for him, and their friends are becoming Christians. So I think in those contexts, you do celebrate them. I mean, I think in my own church, our staff is celebrated. It's been a tough time, but in general, they've really been celebrated. They do really different things. I mean, we basically have a guy on staff we all love, who is his goal. I mean, he is hired to be a liberal Democrat. That's what he's hired to do, and to do impact in the city courts, like literally. And, people love him, but no one understands him. But he is celebrated. Like, he's not, but he knows he'll never, like, in this pastoral search, he won't be a candidate, and he didn't want to be. But when you step out of that, I think you're right. Unfortunately, it's, Fred Harrell can preach, or, Tim Keller has the biggest church in the world in New York City, and that is an upfront ministry. And I'm just saying to you, that's not fair. I mean, even in RUF, the bigger we get, the more mature you have to be, because you just got guys out there doing some amazing stuff, and they're not doing it from the front. And they're doing some stuff that I couldn't do in a million years that's just hard and interesting and multi-ethnic. But I think you're right. But here's my verse. You got to stop fearing men. Stop fearing men and be yourself. Being yourself is having to do a lot of things you don't want to do. That didn't change that. But it does give me the freedom to go, all right, Bill and I have never jihad on this youth team. But doggone it, Bill, Bill's bringing home the bacon. He's doing X for me. And I'm just going to let it go because I need Bill. And I can't do what Bill does. Those are the things I think that matter.
Yeah. How much in your kind of discovery process of that gifting would you say was aided by like outside influence and people saying, and even maybe to a point where they said, no, I think that you are gifted here, you bugged up against that, but then came to realize, okay, maybe they were right. But how much do you feel like was that your personal coming to that point, and also people outside?
Well, students will just tell you what they think. The trouble with student ministry is, they'll be like, you can't preach. It's literally. It's kind of raw.
There are no courtesy laughs in youth.
No, there are not.
It's beautiful.
It's just like they go home and they're like, I don't know if I'm going back next week. That wasn't interesting. But, there's a lot of harder stuff about doing a church in RUF, but I'll tell you this about the RUF crowd, it goes away for 3 months every summer, and you got to hope it shows up in the fall. But I think it's a little bit of both, and I'm more willing to listen than people think I am, but I'm a good observer. Like, one of my gifts is I'm brutally honest about what I see. I just am. So I could see, I got to, even at Tennessee, we got to a season where the small group thing was eating me up. Came home one day and just said, Marissa, I dare somebody to offer me another job. And she said, why? I was like, nobody showed up for 2 small groups. She's like, you can't do small groups. You can't do those. And
Hey John, my all-time favorite John Stone story. Candy factory, night church, serving communion. We all gather up at the table to serve each other at the end. You lean over to Josh Evie and you say, you see that couple back there? I know why they didn't take communion. They slept together and they're guilty. And Josh kind of chuckled and he looked at you and said, well, I think the reason I don't know about that, but they are brother and sister.
But Chris, were they not the most robustly dressed people ever in our church? Yeah, so that was a great moment. Hey, I'm wrong 15-20% of the time. Now I'm totally lost. Oh, yeah. Look, your church is right about you. And I think that's what's hard for people. Your church is not right in the first 3 months, but in the 3rd, 4th year, they're right. So people are going to say about me, I'm not politically savvy. They have to be right. I totally disagree with them, but they have to be right. They've said it for too long, and I disagree with them, but they have to be right. They just do. There's nobody looking at me saying you're politically savvy. So even though I think about the politics of stuff, and my job does at least force me to say to campus ministers, hey guys, we cannot smoke pot at training even though it's legal in Colorado. You cannot, I don't care. I can think about what that will happen, but I'm not savvy. And I want to be, and I'm not. I think that I have a secondary tone in my life. I don't. No one thinks I have a second. I have one tone. It's a single tone. It's loud. It's direct. And I long to have a second tone. I've tried it. I can't whisper. Can't get my voice down. If I turn to you in church and go, hey, did you see don't match. Like some of the back rows, like, I saw his socks. I'm a big picture preacher. I'm not a straight reformed exegeter. That drives me crazy about me. I can try all I want, but I'm a big picture guy. They're just, yeah. And so people have told me, and I've had to listen, but your church is not wrong about you after a certain amount of years. And that's different than, because we're all in this, a family and a group in the church getting mad at you because you did something right or legitimate and they didn't like it. So, in that sense, there's a slice of every church that says, he wants to do youth ministry in the high school and we want it to be a church-based ministry, or we want family-based youth ministry. All those discussions are not what I mean. But when your church is saying to you, you're great at X, you're not doing Y, and you want to do Y, that's when you got to lift. That's what you got to hear. Hey, I still say this because so many of you are preachers or teachers. And Tim Keller said, and he was quoting somebody else, he was quoting somebody else, I don't know the original source, but you got to teach 200 times before you know you can do it. So there is some sense when you become an assistant pastor, your first 50 sermons could be actually decent, but you don't know what your voice is for a long time. That's one of the advantages of RUF is you get a bunch of guinea pigs that don't matter because they got a lot of time left. And you can preach a lot of sermons and get a lot of good feedback. Let's take a break real quick and we'll come back and do the second half. It's 9:53. Let's come back to the